2015. This is the Hermetic Hour. I'm your host, Poke Runyon, and tonight we present a reprise of the 1977 article in the Old Seventh Ray, number 19, by author Janine Renee, entitled Percival and the Hermetic Graal. Now, this author researched and wrote the article at our request. It forms an important element in our reconstructed linkage of ancient Phoenician rituals to early Valentinian Christian Gnosticism and to the medieval Grail lore. Now, the major source for Janine's article is the 1965 book, The Crater and the Grail, Hermetic Sources of the Percival, by Henry and Renee Kahane. Now, modern neo-pagans have never lost their fascination for the Holy Grail quest. The idea that the Grail was originally pagan, the Hermetic Crater, goes along with the recent revelations of Jesus and Mary Magdalene and the paganizing of early Christianity. So, if you want to start on your own Grail quest, tune in and we'll give you directions to the Grail Castle, Mont Sauvat. And, of course, that's why we named one of our temples there in Pasadena, Mont Sauvat. Now, this program tonight follows along with the recent programs that we've had on the Lost Gospel and the whole idea of the succession all the way from ancient Canaan, the rites of Baal and Astarte, which come up all the way through history and all the way through the Bible and come on up to the time of Christ and the early Gnostic interpretations of Christianity, which were, as we have discussed, the Gnostic theory that Jesus was the last of the pagan dying gods and that the goddess Astarte, or Aphrodite, or Astarte, Ishtar, was in fact his priestess and his goddess, and the concept that the Grail is actually not a blood sacrament, but a honey sacrament representing the reproductive process, and that the true passion of Christ is actually his marriage to Mary Magdalene. And this, of course, was brought forward in the Lost Gospel. Now, the connection, of course, to Percival, Percival is the German spelling, and Percival, the romance, the Grail romance, was actually originally written by a German, Wolfram von Essenbach. And it is a King Arthur romance, but it's one of the earliest ones, and it has very definitely, it's Hermetic, rather than Paulian Christian. It's definitely Hermetic, and of course it could certainly be considered to be Gnostic Christian of the Valentinian type, especially that of Marcus. So let's get into this article, and the article is as I say, by Janine Renee, who at the time she wrote it was married to Ed Fitch, who we were closely affiliated with. Now, we'll start off. Wolfram von Essenbach, who lived from about 1170 to 1220 of the Common Era, was one of the greatest poets of the Middle Ages, and certainly the foremost German writer of his time. Let me put on my reading glasses here because the old seventh grade, the type was kind of small. His writing gained him much recognition, and he was patronized by several great lords. He himself was of noble birth, though somewhat impoverished. His works seek to glorify the knightly class. Essenbach enjoyed participating in tournaments and in the active courtly life he wrote so much about. He was an entertainer who recited his poems primarily for the enjoyment, although some of his works were commissioned. Wolfram actually claimed, "I don't know a single letter of the alphabet," but he was obviously a very skilled poet and storyteller. Perhaps this statement can be taken to mean that he was not educated in a conventional curriculum of many of his contemporaries. He began working on Percival around 1197. His other most notable works are Wilhelm and Titruel. Wolfram's Percival is considered by Loomis, 1965, to be the most satisfying medieval treatment of the Grail, due to its scope of action, its harmonious view of the Arthurian, its harmonious view of life, and its deeply spiritual visions. The Percival story, in connection with the Arthurian cycle, became very popular with the poets in the Middle Ages. The most significant early work on this theme was the Contes de Graal, also known as Percival le Gallois, by the late 12th century poet Charentien de Troyes. It was mainly from this well-known romance that Wolfram drew most of his basic plot line and information. Wolfram's Percival is by no means a mere imitation of Charentien's poem, however, for he gave it new meanings and a unique treatment. Much of this he claimed to have received from another source, the highly controversial figure of Provence. According to Wolfram, the poet Coyote had a more correct version of the Percival story than Charentien had. This veritable account Coyote was said to have read in a book he found in Toledo, written in heathen characters by a man named Flagentinus. Now this Flagentinus, who was half pagan, half Jewish by birth, claimed that the original Grail was written in the stars. Now there are many scholars today who feel that Coyote, the provincial poet, is a glorious invention, an imaginative hoax on the part of Wolfram, who, unlike some of the Grail writers, did not lack a sense of humor. However, the possibility that Wolfram's unique rendition of the Percival story is partially based in some ancient heathen tradition has important implications and will be elaborated on further. Being very important to our conclusion, Wolfram's story opens with the adventures of the knight Gamoret while fighting in the Holy Land. Gamoret marries and then deserts the Saracen queen, Belicani, who bears him a piebald child called Firfiz. He is married a second time after winning the hand of Queen Herzlclyde of Wales in a tournament. However, he goes off again in search of adventure and meets his death fighting in heathen lands. Meanwhile, Queen Herzlode bears Gamoret a posthumous son, Percival, whom she brings up in an isolated forest in the hopes that he will never learn about knighthood and follow in his father's footsteps. However, the boy does eventually decide to become a knight at King Arthur's court. His mother dresses the naive child in fool's clothing, hoping that he will return to her after he's been laughed at. In the course of his wanderings, he meets with many adventures. In some cases, his naivete actually causes him to bring harm upon some innocent persons. He does receive some training and advice from a knight, Grenamans, becoming more skilled in his practice of martial arts. Percival rescues and marries the beautiful Conwiramurs, and he then intends to visit his mother, who, unknown to him, has died of a broken heart. While on his journey, Percival happens upon the Grail Castle, the Mount of Salvation, Mont Sauvat. This castle is presided over by King Enfortus, who suffers from a grievous, incurable wound attended by a company of 400 knights and maidens in the service of the Grail. While feasting at the Grail Castle, Percival witnesses several marvels. First, he sees a squire rush in with a bleeding lance amidst the cries and moans of gathered company. Then there is an amazing procession of women culminating in the entrance of the Grail Bearer, a beautiful virgin whose name means knowledge of joy. The grail provides all the food and drink needed by the company. It is described by Wolfram as a very precious stone, lapis excellus. In most legends, the grail is described as a cup or a vessel. In some traditions, it is said to have been the cup from which Christ drank at the Last Supper, and which Joseph of Arimathea caught his blood when he was on the cross. And although Wolfram does not actually describe the grail as such a vessel, we may assume that this is the form that the precious stone takes. The Holy Grail is referred to as the perfection of the earthly paradise, which surpasses every earthly ideal. Of its virtues, Wolfram says, "Never is a man so ill but that if he sees the grail on any day, he is immune from death during the week that follows. And such virtue the stone gives to men that flesh and bones grow young at once. The powers of the grail are said to be renewed every Good Friday by a dove that descends from heaven and places a mass wafer on it." Wolfram mentions that both Phlegentinus and Coyote claimed that the grail had been left on earth by angels, who then returned to the region beyond the stars. Percival is amazed by these wonders, but he holds himself from inquiring about their meaning because Gurnemanz had once told him that to show too much curiosity in anything was considered impolite. Percival's failure to ask any questions is very unfortunate because it happens that, had he done so, the Grail King's affliction would have been cured. The Grail Company has been waiting for many years for someone who would come to the castle and lift the enchantment by asking Anfortas the meaning of the strange events shown. The next morning, Percival wanders out into the forest, having found the castle empty, and proceeds on to the court of King Arthur. At King Arthur's court, Percival is about to be admitted to the Round Table Fellowship because of the many valorous deeds he has performed in the past. The celebration is interrupted by Lady Kundry, a hideous sorceress who is the Grail's herald. She denounces Percival as unworthy of knighthood because he failed to inquire into the meaning of what he saw in the Grail Castle, thus failing to alleviate King Anfortas' suffering. Percival takes these reproaches deeply to heart, and he becomes embittered with God, whom he believes has shamed and deserted him. He leaves King Arthur's hall in a state of anger and humiliation. For 5 years he travels, encountering many adventures, yet still in a state of conflict and rebellion against God, hoping that somehow he may find the Grail again and make up for his serious omission. All this time, however, Percival does remain free from taint or falseness. At this point, Wolfram shifts much of the action of the story to Gawain, another knight of the Round Table, describing at length many of Gawain's adventures and love affairs. Gawain is described by J.G. Robertson in 1970 as a sympathetic figure who serves as a foil to the pure and unworthy Percival. Wolfram is able to maintain a good balance between the adventure of the dissimilar heroes, although for a while Percival is very much in the background. It happens one Good Friday that Percival meets a pilgrim, an old knight who reproaches him for bearing arms on a holy day. Percival begins to experience some remorse and is persuaded to visit a hermit in the forest. This hermit, Treversent, discusses with Percival the path to repentance and explains many of the mysteries of the Grail to him. Percival leaves Treversent with a new and optimistic outlook. He is readmitted to the Round Table and finally meets his pagan half-brother, Percival. Here at court, Kundry reappears and reveals that Percival has won the privilege to return to the Grail. He and Percival journey to the Grail Castle, where they are joined by Percival's wife, Conduiramir's, and the twin sons that she has born him. Meanwhile, one of whom, Lohengrin, is the subject of another legend. And they come into the presence of the Grail Company, and Percival asks the question, "What does this mean?" Whereupon Anfortis's curse is lifted. Percival is made the new Grail King amidst great rejoicing. Firfiz finds himself unable to see the Grail until he receives baptism, and he then marries Rapunzel de Joy, the former Grail bearer, the Princess of Joy, and returns to the Orient to convert heathendom, assuming her convert heathendom to Christianity. Lohengrin is also initiated into the Brotherhood of the Grail and later succeeds Percival as the head of the order. Now, Wolfram is very modern in his treatment of martial and sexual relationships, and his attitude toward love and marriage is noteworthy. Percival, the ideal knight, is completely faithful to his wife, whereas Gawain, who symbolizes the worldly knight, has quite a series of affairs. In a time when marriages were arranged and often loveless, the tender bond between Percival and Conduiramir's is especially refreshing. This is masterfully described by Helen Mustard in her commentary on Percival. At the highest level, the delicate and tender love of Percival and Conduiramir's, which is fully consummated, almost sanctified at the close, when their reunion is associated with Percival's reunion with the Grail. And, of course, this relates to the sacred marriage. Wolfram's enlightened approach also stands in contrast to the stark dualistic and aesthetic aspects part of earlier treatments of the Percival theme. Here, the hero of the spiritual quest must be able to function in the real world. And as Mustard puts it, Percival is urged by Trevisan to continue in the practice of knighthood even while searching for the Grail. The two worlds, the Grail world and the world of knighthood, are constantly intermingling. It is clear that Wolfram is affirming the goodness and meaningfulness of life in this world, and the Grail sphere is not set in opposition to life itself, but is simply the other side of the scales, another aspect of human existence. This very dynamic nature of the hero, whose spiritual strivings are complemented by his active and successful involvement in the affairs of real life, is brought out by Trevisan's statement to Percival after the latter has attained kingship of the Grail. You have forced God by defiance to make his infinite Trinity grant your will. I grieved for your trials, for had it never happened that anyone could ever fight his way to the Grail, and I would gladly have dissuaded you. Now it has turned out otherwise with you. And this is Mustard and Passage, 1961. Consider the fatalistic nature of medieval Christianity. Wolfram von Essenbach's comments on free will and human greatness must have been highly revolutionary concepts. The Grail quest can be seen to have its precedence in the mythologies of many lands. The fact that these recurring themes have intrigued folklorists, some trying to track down a specific first source, while others attribute it to basic psychic unity of mankind. And thus the question of mythological origins has caused some lengthy scholarly debates. At this point in her manuscript, the author offers a 750-word summary of major Grail themes, which we regret our length requirements will not allow us to include. This is referring to the commentary by Kahane and Kahane, the Cracker and the Grail. However, whatever may have been the original source of the Percival and the Holy Grail legends, Wolfram, who was of a mystical nature, has imbued the Percival story with spiritual meanings more explicit than any other rendition. Percival has come to be subjected to many highly Christianized interpretations due to the Christian features which overlay the narrative. Such views especially tend to dwell on Percival's sins of pride and anger with God. And frequently Percival's silence and his failure to ask the question of Amorphous are attributed to a youthful callousness to suffering. In the 19th century, the great German composer Richard Wagner did an operatic rendition of Percival. Wagner altered Wolfram von Essenbach's story and its meanings considerably. Mustard and Passage in their commentary on Essenbach state that Wagner's Percival, splendid as it may be musically, is as a literary work pretentiously moralizing in its operatic libretto, wholly alien in spirit to the work it professes to dramatize. This refers in part to the exaggeratedly Christian overtones which Wagner lends to the story. The most compelling interpretation of the Holy Grail is revealed in the light of the Hermetic treatises, the spiritual texts of the non-Christian mystery cult, which grew out of the Greco-Egyptian and Judaic influences characterizing the dynamic intellectual milieu of 2nd century Alexandria. Henry and René Kahane are the major proponents of this theory. In their The Crater and the Grail, Hermetic Sources of the Percival, 1965, they state that our hypothesis is that the Percival myth is based via an intermediate stage of Arabic transmission on the Hermetic treatises, and they proceed to analyze and elaborate in striking parallels between the Crater of the Corpus Hermeticum and the Grail, and its significance in Wolfram's Percival. And the Crater, of course, refers also to the constellation Crater in the zodiac. Of the Hermetic texts written originally in Greek, 17 treatises have been preserved. They comprise the Corpus Hermeticum, forming a loose synchronistic system which was compiled into its present form between the 6th and the 11th centuries of the Common Era. Among these, the Pomandrace, or Divine Pomander, contains 14 of the texts. The 4th text of the Pomander, called the Crater, and the 13th treatise, the Palaeogenesis, contain material relevant to Percival, and some of the ideas expressed are similar to certain Christian doctrines because Christianity originated as an offshoot of the early Gnostic sects. In the 4th Hermetic, the significance of the Holy Grail is tied in with the act of baptism in the intellect, in the mystic vessel, Crater, associated with the constellation Crater. And in a dialogue which takes place between Hermes Trismegistus, the avatar of the Hermetic writings, and his disciple Tot, the student asks, "Tell me then, Father, why did God not impart the intellect to all men?" To which the master replies, "It was his will, my son, that intellect should be placed in the midst as a prize that human souls may win." And where did he place it? And Hermes gives the highly symbolic answer. He filled a great Crater with intellect and set it down to earth, and he appointed a herald and bade him make the proclamation to the hearts of men. "Dip yourself in this Crater, you who are able and who believe that you will ascend to him who sent the Crater down. You who know what purpose for which you have been born." Now they who gave heed to the proclamation and were baptized in the intellect, those men got a share of the gnosis, in effect the knowledge of God. And they became perfect men because they received intellect. And this is from Kahane, 1965. Similarly, the idea of baptism, revelation, and rebirth are important in Percival. Thus, Percival's half-brother, the pagan Perphes, finds the Grail to be invisible to him until he's baptized. And the Kahanes point out that the heathen Phlegentus, Wolfram's and Coyote's source, is here insisting on the Christian baptism of the Grail's guardians. It is no longer strange when baptism is understood as baptism in the Hermetic crater. The nature of the initiatory process in the Hermetic Brotherhoods also corresponds with the Percival story. The wandering innocent fool, here being the candidate for initiation. All candidates undergo a series of tests to win membership into the spiritual community, and accordingly, the stages of Hermetic instruction are identified, with the stages constituting the journey of Wolfram's Meist. These, for the basic structure of the central and religious core of the Percival's ignorance: selection, revelation, penitence, rebirth. Kahane and Kahane point out many of the parallels, such as the similarities between the lives of the members of the Grail Fellowship and the Hermetic community. Women were included in the Hermetic orders as in the Grail Castle. Parenthood was exalted in both cases. The wound in the testicles, which was the cause of Amfortas' suffering, can be compared to the concept of suffering in the senses, in effect the inadequacy of the senses. And there are also many Hermetic prototypes to be found in the major characters such as Amfortas, Titurel, Trevisan, and Perfis, etc. The Hermetic comparison also provides an answer to a problem posed by Arthur Edward Waite, who was critical because, quote, the Pascal dish of the Galahad quest, in effect the other versions of the Grail legend, began on earth and was taken into heaven, but the history of the German Hallow is the converse of this. The origin is celestial, but in the end it is left on earth, and there is no reason assigned for bringing the Grail to earth, nor do we hear of its purpose or nature prior to this event. However, when the crater is viewed as a prize of intellect placed in the midst of men that human souls may strive for it, the reason for the Grail's descent to the human world becomes readily intelligible. Kahane and Kahane devoted the final section of their book reconstructing and outlining the process of transmission by which the 12th century poet Wolfram could have become familiar with these Hermetic teachings. And the most likely course is that these Greco-Egyptian texts were translated into Arabic and carried to the flourishing cultural centers of Moorish Spain by such groups as the 9th century Sabaeans of Haran, a sect which combined pagan and Islamic traditions. And I said see the editorial in this particular issue. But Flagente's work must have been of this nature, although it cannot be known how closely the Arabic text is followed the Greek originals. Hermetic materials became very popular among Jewish scholars in Spain, and who were devoted to a study of Arab manuscripts. The Kahanes speculate that Wolfram's source, Coyote, was probably a man known as William of Tudela, possibly a converted Jew, who had been involved in and had some familiarity with the Moorish cultural milieu. There was some interchange between Moorish Spain and the scholars of medieval Europe, such that the Hermetic doctrines were in vogue by the end of the 12th century. Thus, a person of Wolfram's broad range of knowledge, a transmission of this Hermetic lore was logically possible. The Percival, Wolfram von Essenbach's Epic of Chivalry can therefore be seen to explore spiritual depths uncommon to the stylistic modes and literature of the Middle Ages. Its spiritual import makes it the most meaningful early treatment of the Percival Grail quest theme. Its inspiration is taken from ancient sources, especially from the transcendental doctrines of the Hermetic treatises, and through the Percival, Wolfram expresses ideals which, in the nature of their Faustian strivings, hold a strong appeal to the modern mind. And the partial bibliography for this article is, of course, Kahane and Kahane, the Crater and the Grail, Hermetic Sources of the Percival, University of Illinois Press, and that's 1965. That you can get used copies of that, by the way. And then Loomis, Roger S., The Graal from Celtic Myth to Christian Symbol. Mustard and Passages, 1961, Wolfram von Essenbach, and that's a vintage book, the Percival. And Arthur Edward Waite, The Holy Grail, The Galahad Quest in Arthurian Literature, and that's university books, and that I believe is out of print. But I would also add to that From Ritual to Romance by Jesse Weston. And now, let me say a few things about this. Number one, I think Kahane and Kahane's book, which by the way, I think is very, very important, especially to our tradition. Kahane and Kahane's book delivers arguments. The Percival is a hermetic allegory. Their arguments are really overwhelming, and so we can, and also too the idea that they have that the Sabaeans brought it over. We've discussed this before, of course, on this show, and also in the Seventh Ray. Haran, over at the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates River, right there, right now. It's a little bit over the Turkish border side. Haran was the last of the Star Kings, the last of the Magi and the Babylonian Magi. They were the last holdout, and they were Hermetic. The North Sabaeans of Haran were Hermetic, and they brought the whole Hermetic corpus, along with their Star Lore, their Babylonian Star Lore that they preserved, into the Arabic, the Arabic culture after the Arabic breakout in 600 A.D. These Sabaeans were exempt from forced conversion to Islam. They could do horoscopes. They could teach magic, and they did, and they were the magicians of the Arabian Nights. Now they also were professors and taught astrology and magic over in Spain and in the Spanish universities. And the early Kabbalists were very much influenced by these Haranian Sabaeans. So what we're looking at really is the Percival, Wolfram von Essenbach, is influenced by this Hermetic Sabaean tradition. Now, I want to before we go any further, I want to mention that there is a dissenting opinion on. There is another book that is a commentary. It's a popular book, by the way. It's not as scholarly as Kahane's and Kahane's, but I think we should mention it. And it's called The Cup of Destiny: The Quest for the Grail by Trevor Ravenscroft. And he's the guy that wrote The Spear of Destiny, which you may remember. And frankly, The Cup of Destiny is more of a scholar. I have problems with the Spear of Destiny. The Spear of Destiny historically I have problems with that. But this particular book, he has this Cup of Destiny is I think more nicely done. What Ravenscroft is suggesting in the Cup of Destiny, he is taking again the Percival primarily as his Grail romance, and he's saying that he's not going along with the Hermetic idea. He thinks that the force, the system behind the Percival is, according to him, Manichaeanism. Now, Manichaeanism was kind of the last of the Gnostic heresies. It incorporated a lot of actually it was very much influenced by Hermeticism and also by Mithraism, which also has Hermetic elements. But Manichaeanism began over in Persia about 300 A.D. and this Persian prophet Mani, who according to whatever biographical information we have on him. He was raised by a scholar over there who apparently seems to have been Hermetic, and perhaps a Sabaean. But Manny took all of this and created his own religion and his own philosophy, and he hung it on Christianity, and it's kind of a Gnostic Christian, very much like Marcion. He's very, very similar to Marcion. He created this Persian version of Gnostic Christianity, which included Zoroastrian elements, and was very, very solar. And whereas we tend to think that Jesus, when Jesus got transmuted into a sun god, which began to occur at a very early date, by the way, we sort of thought that was a Roman Sol Invictus kind of thing, and it may very well have been. And of course, Manny, though, also had this Sol Invictus idea that Jesus was a sun god, and equating him to the Ahura Mazda in the Zoroastrian idea of light against darkness. So this Manichaeism was a Persian version of solaristic Gnostic Christianity, and it spread. Once it got going. By the way, we should mention that Mani also thought that he was the reincarnation not just of Jesus, but he thought he was Buddha and Zoroaster, and he even got Ganesha into into his pantheon, and Krishna, and he was going to be all things to all men. And his cult got started in Persia, and it spread into Eastern Europe, and it got all the way to France by the 4th century, and into that, and it influenced a sect, the Albigensians, the people they call the Cathars, were very much influenced by Manichaeanism. One of the things about Manichaeanism, which is completely different, however, than the earlier Gnostic Christianity of Valentinian and Marcus, which is more in the line that we think of, and also more in the line of the Hermetic tradition, is that the Manichaeans believed, along with Marcion, that Jesus was a completely supernatural being. He had no physical existence. They thought that he was entirely spiritual, had no physical. Well, this doesn't line up, of course, with other aspects of the Graal tradition, which the Hermetic tradition does. And one of the aspects of the Graal tradition that the Percival definitely goes with is the so-called bloodline. And those of you who are familiar with Holy Blood, Holy Grail, you can't have you have to have a physical. Jesus has to have a physical nature. He has to have a physical host in order to have a bloodline. And so this Manichaean Christianity or the Cathar Christianity is just really it's too spiritual for that kind of thing. And yet the Cathars, there have been several books, not just Ravenscroft, several other books trying to indicate that the Cathars really were the custodians of the Grail. Well, and this is also Ravenscroft's idea that this Manichaean later Manichaean Christianity underlies the Percival. Well, he's got an argument, and yet at the same time, I think Kahane, their scholarship is better, and I think their evidence is better. And of course, naturally, we prefer being Hermetic and coming all the way through from pagan roots. We prefer the the Kahane idea that the Percival is essentially hermetic, and of course Marcus, the last of the Valentinian Gnostic Christians that did get to southern France and the Rhone River Valley, and he, of course, was certainly hermetic and very much following the Jesus and Mary Magdalene idea that the sacred marriage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene is the real passion of Christ, according to the Valentinian Marcus and according to the graal symbolism of that's refined in the Percival. So the Percival is very, very important in this whole tradition. It brings us all the way through, and I'd like to say too that I think Mani himself was influenced by the so-called Nicene document and the way his thing played out. The Nicene document, which we've discussed, and that's the only copy of it we have, of course, is Hippolytus's Refutation of All Heresies. But essentially, what the Nicene document says, and Jessie Weston covered in her From Ritual to Romance, is that the dying gods, starting with way back with Osiris and Tammuz, and the dying god and the eternal goddess, this is the big secret behind the Grail and behind in Christianity, and eventually Jesus becomes the last of the dying gods. And, of course, Mary Magdalene is the last of the priestesses of the eternal goddess. So another aspect of this that we should definitely look at is the concept of just exactly what is the secret of the Grail. Now, and what is this question that Percival is supposed to ask Amfortas? What ails you, Father? And our answer to that is that Amfortas says, I'm afraid to die, my son. That's our answer to it. But the real answer to all this question, and the one that we find in most of the Grail literature, and the big secret is the king and the land are one. If the king ails, the land ails. If the land is laid waste, it means that the king is ill and is dying. And if we heal the king, we heal the land. Now, the significance of this is that the king represents everyone who quests for the Grail. The king, everybody is his own king or queen, and so if you're seeking revival and you're seeking healing, and the Grail, of course, will do that. Now, the king and the land are one. This I think those of you who've seen Excalibur, you recall when King Arthur rides out for his last, he recovers and he rides out for his last battle. He rides, and all the flowers are blooming when they're riding through the woods, the knights, because the king is renewed and the land is prospering. And of course our Canaanite seasonal ceremonies do exactly this sort of thing as they do. Maal is killed by the Grim Reaper moat at summer solstice, and that's calcination, and then we have solution in the fall when the rains come, and then separation in the north, and then finally in the spring we have conjunction with the sacred marriage. And so those are the first primal operations of alchemy, and that goes right along with the idea of the king and the land are one. And so the Grail is the symbol really of the heavenly, of the knowledge of God and of the knowledge of the alchemy of the human spirit, the alchemy of the alchemy of nature and the human body. And So this entire graal cycle is one that we celebrate both through its pagan origins, all the way up through Christianity. And we realize when we look at all of this in this time track, and we look at all of this in this mythology, we realize that Christianity's origins really go all the way back to the early vegetation gods and the early vegetation spirits. And the mystery of the Grail, of course, is the mystery that it's primarily, in a way, it's primarily sexual, because it involves procreation, it involves growth, it involves renewal, it involves and Percival becomes the Grail King. Percival becomes the Grail King because he comes and realizes, he asks the question, he finally realizes what this is all about. And this means that really what we're saying here, that should be obvious. Okay, you didn't ask these questions. Well, then that means, well, what are you looking for if you didn't ask the questions? You're supposed to be looking for, you want to be if you're going to be the Grail King, you better find out what you're going to be king of, and you better find out what's going on. So actually, the questions are the quest itself, and this is what's meant by this. If you don't ask the questions about what's going on here, then obviously you're not looking. You're not on a quest. So the Grail, we're all trying to find the Grail, but the Grail, of course, the real Grail is within ourselves. And I think that the Grail is in the heavens, and there is a great deal of celestial symbolism involved in going up and drinking from the crater on the way down, and all of this symbolism can be researched in the works that we've cited through our studies. And I think, as I said, the Kahane and Kahane's book, certainly you'll read that along with the Percival. And if you want to look at what Ravenscroft has to say, this Cup of Destiny should be looked at, because the Manichaean, as far as I'm concerned, the Manichaeans, even though they're totally spiritual, Jesus does kind of miss the point. But they certainly had an influence, and they certainly shouldn't be forgotten. So that I think gives you a pretty good rundown on the Wolfram Van Essenbach's Percival. And next week we will we'll look at Melchizedek and Solomon and Enoch, and we'll start tracing that whole thing in relation to the Hermetic tradition, and also in relation to our Phoenician seasonal ceremonies and our particular version of this entire track through mythological history. And let's not forget that Hercules is certainly a form of the questing god, and we have quite a debt that we owe to Greek mythology in this regard also. So until next week, take care, be well, and good magic.